SwayamPrabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Hello and welcome to today's session where we look at this Anglo-Saxon narrative poem titled Beowulf. Beowulf is a narrative poem that has survived since the Anglo-Saxon period. So it is very, very old, and it also belongs to the Old English period. This is considered as a first masterpiece of English literature, but nevertheless this has been written in the Old English script, which has very little similarity with the current English script. And the poem is set in Scandinavia, and the origins are tentatively during the Nordic or Viking invasion of Britain, and this is just before the Norman conquest, which happens in 1066 AD. And if you're familiar with the British history, you would also know that this is a phenomenal year. This is an iconic year in British history, 1066. That is when the Anglo-Saxon era is supposedly said to have begun. Beowulf, this narrative poem, is now considered more significant in terms of its history. There is a historical significance attached to the manuscript, and this manuscript is, interestingly, it still survives in the British Library, and this was copied around the year 1000 AD. And given the ways in which most other manuscripts have been lost or have got destroyed, it's rather surprising and very interesting that Beowulf's manuscript has survived till date. The one event which provoked and triggered an interest in Beowulf in the 20th century was this amazing paper written by the master fantasy writer Tolkien, and the paper was titled Beowulf, the Monsters and the Critics. Tolkien, who is better famed as the author of the Lord of the Rings series, he tried to promote the historical and social study of Beowulf in the context of literary and artistic content. And in this paper, which was read out in a session in 1936, he also argued that the mythical content needs to be paid attention to, because the other critics, the other historians who've been studying Beowulf, they had often disregarded the element of the myth, the presence of the dragons, the giants, the supernatural elements which were an integral part of Beowulf. They were often disregarded by the historians and the critics. And Tolkien's main argument was that such details are entirely relevant because they tell us about the socio-cultural context of those period, because they serve to inform the reader about the belief systems in Britain and Europe at that time. And since those periods, those eras are very little documented and there is very little archaeological evidence, Tolkien also suggests that one should consider looking at Beowulf not merely as an aesthetic text, not merely as a social historical document, but also as some kind of a document which will tell us about the belief systems of those periods, the ways in which people thought, people believed, and people conceived of the world around them. And it's also interesting to note that for the Anglo-Saxons, the time during which this epic was written, it was conceived, it was composed, it was getting circulated, during that time, monsters and myths were not make-believe things for them. They were actually perceived as real phenomena, and they were considered as things to be believed and feared, and they were an integral part of the belief system of those times, of those world orders. And in the contemporary, when we look at Beowulf, it is perhaps little more than an entertaining and engaging tale for us. And of course, this is one of those texts which also tells us about the evidence of the oral tradition and how it has survived across the many challenges of time and across these many centuries. And it's also telling us about the significance of imagination, which lives and outlives the times of the text, and also how the way in which it travels across centuries. One significant evidence is the recent adaptation of Beowulf, a 2007 computer animated film, and needless to say, it was a huge success as well. So in this context, I would also like to draw your attention to the comment made by one of the critical historians. The readers of such modern imitations have to suspend their disbelief in order to enter such worlds of fantasy. The original audiences of Beowulf, which is the Anglo-Saxon audience, they actually believed every word. And this is of utmost significance to us when we try to engage with Beowulf in the contemporary. As noted in the beginning of this lecture, the survival of the manuscript is something which amazed the historians and the archaeologists, and it continues to amaze the ones who are undertaking a serious study of this text of Beowulf. And this is incidentally the only text to have survived the ravages of time, and this is considered as a significant historical artifact today. And it is possible that many other tales were also written down during that time, but since we do not have any evidence either in terms of manuscript or in terms of other oral traditions which were handed down over ages, there is very little known about them. And this manuscript, the manuscript of Beowulf, it was also badly damaged by fire, and as the historians note it, but somehow its cargo of words journeyed from the Dark Ages through the Middle Ages and into the modern age. And this is the journey of survival of this manuscript. Beowulf was written in the Novel Codex. It was written in Old English, and this is said to have been composed during the 10th and early 11th centuries. And this is also a text which takes us through this transition from the early medieval towards the middle medieval period. So the historical significance, we also note that it supersedes all the other qualities attached to this text. Who was the author of Beowulf? Needless to say, this was written anonymously, and that was the order of the day during those times. We do not find the name of the author or the authors. There's no way of knowing whether it was authored by a single figure or it was a collaborative collective effort. During those days, there was not this tradition of putting down the name under any text, and it could also have been an orally transmitted narrative poem. But there is this wide conjecture that this was perhaps written by a monk or someone else with an academic inclination, because very few were literate during those times and not many had access to a formal education. And there is this assumption that to be able to write such a refined kind of narrative, perhaps the author figure or the author figures had access to some incredible kind of education as well. And some historians also believe that it was perhaps a Christian who converted from his pagan Anglo-Saxon beliefs to Christianity. Maybe the author was such a figure. And this Christian author, his intellectual horizons perhaps have been expanded to include not only biblical learning, but the wider world of Christian Latin culture in general, because we do see that background in this text getting manifested in very obvious ways. But there is also this contestation that the author perhaps was not a Christian at all. Maybe Christianity was attributed to the author so that it fits in well with the history of the nation, that it gets elevated to the national, to the level of the national epic, the earliest surviving masterpiece of English literature. So perhaps Christianity had to be attributed to this author figure in order to give the text more legitimacy and more credibility. But as noted, there's no way of knowing these things for sure. And the author figure whose presence is very evident in this text, he is viewing the events from a temporal perspective of hundreds of years removed from the time of poem's action. So it is also, we are also given to understand that though this is written in the 10th and 11th centuries, maybe the action happened a few centuries back, and most of them they agree upon 8th century as the century of consensus. Who was Beowulf? Beowulf is the protagonist. The narrative poem is also titled after the protagonist. One does not know whether Beowulf actually existed or not. There is some element of truth perhaps, because there is a lot of historical elements that we find in this poem, but we never know for sure, since there has not been any documentation or archaeological evidence to prove that such a character, such a historical leader, that such a historical figure actually existed. The possibility is that he must have been the leader of the Geats some centuries before the story was recorded, and later perhaps the stories of his exploits became intertwined with supernatural elements. And this is something we notice with most of the writings of the earlier times, because the past kings, though they were vested with the authority and power, they also had to be elevated in terms of their mental and physical attribute in order to cultivate some amount of mystique and authority among the people. So always in the stories of heroes, in the stories of kings, we do find a supernatural element getting intertwined either into their personality or into the scheme of events. This narrative poem can be best described as a heroic tale. It has 3,182 lines. There is no title in the manuscript which has been discovered. Historians have attributed this title because they must have thought it is rather simple and straightforward to name the poem after the protagonist. This is one of the very few texts which show us the strong Germanic roots of the English nation. It also displays the qualities of English language and English literary tradition before they became intermingled with French, the classical and other non-Germanic cultures. If you're familiar with the background history of Britain as a nation, the way in which it emerged through these different invasions and how the various influences had come to shape English literature and English culture and English language, you would perhaps be able to make better sense of the way in which the Germanic roots can be traced in this particular text. This poem Beowulf has been considered spectacular in terms of its refined style and lofty theme, and given that this was part of the Old English tradition, Old English literature, it's rather surprising that such a kind of nobility could have been imparted to a text of those times. And we also find very generous descriptions about the Danes, the Swedes, the Franks, the Frisians, and also the Gates. And Gates were the group of people who inhabited what is today southern Sweden. And at the same time, we do not find a single mention of any English man. Perhaps this is because the Anglo-Saxon narrator was looking back at a period which included an assortment of tribes, an assortment of invaders which who were not really English. But of course, the ancestors could be traced back, and it's in that context that this text is seen as a significant historical artifact as well. The poem opens in Denmark and not in Geatland, where Beowulf lives. And at the outset itself, we are being told, the readers are being told, that this is a story about noblemen. And it begins to trace the origins of the Danish dynasty, and then it moves to the poem's present, which is during the reign of the Danish king Hrothgar. And Hrothgar, incidentally, was a figure well known to several earlier Scandinavian writers. We find King Hrothgar being mentioned in different other texts, which also leads us to this assumption that Hrothgar was perhaps a real historical king who lived during those times. And there is every reason to also assume that there's a lot of history which is part of this otherwise supernatural, mythical, narrative heroic tale. So the poem talks about the Danish king Hrothgar's glorious reign and how he even erected a certain kind of a pedestal, a certain kind of a building for all his retinue to assembly and to have a good time. It's in this such pleasant context that a monstrous troll Grendel intervenes. He begins with a series of nocturnal attacks. The king's retinue is constantly under threat, under attack, and we are also given to understand from the poem that this monstrous troll Grendel is a begotten descendant of the primordial fratricide Cain. And here we also find a number of biblical allusions, and we are also given to understand that Grendel suffers the wrath of the Christian god. And though characters in the poem themselves are not familiar with Christianity, we do find the Christian tropes becoming extremely significant and even dominant in certain places. So the young hero Beowulf decides to intervene. He resolves to travel from Geatland with 14 followers. He wanted to go to Denmark and then conquer and defeat this monster Grendel, who's been causing such great threat and agony to the king and his followers. And he eventually succeeds in doing that. There are a lot of graphic details through which the poem takes us. And Beowulf manages to defeat Grendel. He even wrenches off Grendel's arm. But then there's also this series of events that follow. Beowulf gets to celebrate his victory with the king and the courtiers. But he also has to face the vengeance, the wrath of Grendel's mother. We find Grendel's mother coming back with a savage attack. This narrative poem is very, very eventful. So I will spare you the many details which are part of the poem from this part onwards. And at the end, through these series of battles, after series of victories that Beowulf enjoys, a dragon kills Beowulf at the end. So more than the storyline, what makes this poem enduring to us is the presence of this varied characters and elements which are quite unlike the Old English period. And some of those traits even appear as very modern in terms of their conception, in terms of their representation and their manifestation within this poem. We find dark allusions in the poem throughout. This could be attributed to both the biblical and pagan traditions. We also find that there is a very fine conflation of history and fantasy, of dignity and horror, and which is why historians and literary critics feel that this is a very unusual kind of a narrative where we find this nobility of purpose and dignity of diction dominating the structure. The human characters, most of the human characters, there's every good reason to assume that they were taken from history, but the monstrous adversaries in the form of the dragons, in the form of these monstrous trolls like Grendel, they were all perhaps the nightmarish products of the ancient demonology of the north. And Grendel, the monstrous troll himself, that was perhaps a monster straight out of Germanic mythology. And he was also considered as a manifestation of evil. And he was rightly understood by the Christian audience as the evil personified. It also made this battle between the good and the evil very appropriate in the English context. And as pointed out earlier, it also made this text a very legitimate and a credible text to be presented at the outset of the emergence of the English nation. There's something very surprising about the existence of the dragons and how the poem deals with it. There is historical evidence to show that the Anglo-Saxons continued to believe in the existence of dragons for a long time. In fact, in one of the entries, the entry for the year 793 in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, it's documented there that fiery dragons were seen flying through the air. Of course, it was a figment of the imagination, but the point to be underscored is that they continue to believe in it, and which is why it is important to see this poem not as an act of a suspension of disbelief, but as an extension of the belief system of the people who lived and read during those times. Also, in the second part of the Old English maxims, we find this mention of a dragon. A dragon is found in a cave, old and glorying in his treasure. So dragons were part of the everyday reality, the belief system of the Anglo-Saxon. In this wonderfully crafted work, the Cambridge Companion to the Old English Literature, we find a very detailed, a well worked out essay by Fred C. Robinson on Beowulf. And here he notes that the subject matter of Beowulf then suggests that a poem whose mind is well stocked with the imaginative literature of the early Germanic peoples, and who has a fairly firm command of the history of Germania in the 5th and 6th centuries, has combined the two, giving a historical setting and weight to legends of preternatural creatures which are hostile to mankind and of a mighty hero who dares to challenge the evil monsters. And this is the way in which the poem has successfully managed to bring together these differing elements. And in spite of that, the loftiness, the refinement of the poem is very hard to miss as well. And one thing that has always captured the attention of the critics and the historians is the religious atmosphere of the poem, the background which the poem very subtly continues to invoke. There is an attempt to showcase how admirable and at times even exemplary the non-Christian ancestors could be. And here this is done with a lot of caution. The poet, the narrator, is also careful not to appear to be encouraging to return to the dark ways of Germanic pagan ways. So there is a fine balance which has been struck throughout this narrative. And the way in which the poet, the narrator, the way in which he has managed to achieve a resolution of conflicting imperatives is really impressive. The poet's own fate we get to know through a reading of this poem, that It is strongly Christian, though there are historians and critics who have argued otherwise. They also argue that maybe the later manuscript editors and the translators had very consciously injected this poem with predominant Christian elements. But nevertheless, it's hard to miss the allusion to a number of biblical events such as the flood, the last judgment, Cain's slaying of Abel. And the characters in the poem at the same time, they themselves never allude to any Christian law, because the information of Christianity, the belief system which was part of Christianity, was not yet available to them. They were not yet part of it. So there are references to pagan rites, and there is also this overarching Christian theme and the allusion to the biblical events. Here we also find a fine statement of a Germanic heroic code. Here we find that the presence of this code dignifies the hero's embarkation on a battle far more perilous than the one with Grendel. And this happens when Grendel's mother comes, and then the fight with the dragon ensues. And this is a rough translation of the section which also tells us about the Germanic heroic code. I read to you very briefly from this segment. Each of us must abide the end of earthly life. Let him who can achieve fame before his death. That is the best there is for a dead warrior. Arise, Lord of the realm. Let's go swiftly to see the track of Grendel's kinswoman. I promise to you that she shall not escape to cover, neither into the earth's embrace, nor into the mountain torrent, nor into the ocean's depth. Go where she will. There are a lot of contestations through which the poem continues to go through, whether it was of literate or oral origin, whether it is from a Christian or a pagan system, or whether it's mostly history or entirely elements of fantasy. But in spite of this narrative poem Beowulf, it continues to be of utmost significance for us in the contemporary, for the very reason that Fred Robinson reminds us. It may be that we, more than the Anglo-Saxon audience for which Beowulf was originally created, can feel a close kinship with the desperate men of old, and can hope that we may learn from their heroic acceptance. I hope you will also find this observation very pertinent and extremely important in our understanding of this narrative poem Beowulf. I thank you for your time, and I look forward to seeing you in the next session.